Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to crisis management, risk management, business continuity, resilience, COVID, well-being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community plan for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there, so I'm really easy to find. Alternatively, you can find me at alexfullick.com. If you've watched the show before, you have probably seen my guest today. We talked about risks and had a chat about IPEC risks, and we didn't get into too much about that. So I've invited today's guest back, Tony Thornton, to come back and talk about IPEC risks, and we can dig into them a little bit more. Tony, welcome back.
Thanks, Alex. Great to see you again.
Yep, you too. And you're not traveling this time? I know last time I was catching you just before you were traveling.
That's right. No, not traveling. My wife and family still back in the UK. I've got 6 months freedom from me just now. So,
I'm gonna have to
look at it the other way
I might
around.
have to edit that piece out just in case they see this. Well, as I said, we're going to be talking about IPEC risks. So let's jump straight into it. Can you recap what IPEC stands for and what IPEC risks are?
Yeah, sure, Alex. IPEC is an acronym which I like to apply to those risks which I think everybody who has their eyes open in an organization will realize that they face. But actually, in my view, they don't lend themselves to the traditional way of assessing and managing risks. And the reason for that is because the organization does not have any influence over the likelihood of occurrence of IPEC type risk events. So we are talking about things such as terrorism, such as geopolitical upheaval, such as extreme weather, such as pandemic, such as a cyber attack. These kinds of things are not within the immediate control of the organization. And whereas they can influence the impact, and this is the key thing, they can influence the impact, they can't influence the likelihood of the occurrence of the event. Now, I was having a conversation recently, somebody who said, well, that's nonsense because, you know, if I live on a fault line, for example, and I contact all the scientists there, they do all these sort of tests and they can tell me what the likelihood of an earthquake is between, you know, a certain bracket, a certain range of time. And I have to explain to them, you've missed the point. Yes, they're able to give you an idea when it can occur, but they cannot stop the thing occurring. That's the point. You can't influence the likelihood of occurrence of these things. And that's the I. That's the I from IPEC risks. Before I go on, I think it's a bit contrived, I have to say. I put my hands up because most of my time in risk has been in the oil and gas business, and I thought everybody's familiar with OPEC. I thought if I use OPEC, it'd be a good way for them to remember it. Let's hope it does. Let's hope it sticks. Who knows? But anyway, the P in IPEC risk is the perpetual. Now, anybody that's reading and risk management and reports, you know, at a high level or at regular intervals, so quarterly reporting to the board or every 4 months reporting, whatever your regime may be, you'll find that certain kinds of risks or certain specific risks actually appear time after time after time after time after time, and you can occasionally get your feet held to the fire over this one, and board directors have complained of the monotony of risk registers because, you know, we've seen this before. These things you're always reporting. Yes, well, of course you are, because they're always there. That's the point. But perhaps what we should be doing is taking, and this we'll come on to this later, is taking them out of the traditional reporting structure and finding another way to report them. But to get to the point, the P here is perpetual, because these risks are constantly recurring and they will be reported to the board time after time after time, or you wouldn't be responsible in doing your job. So we've got no influence. We have the fact that they're perpetual. And thirdly, I think probably people can guess now, the E is that they are all external in origin. If they were internal in origin, you would have some form of control, some influence over both the likelihood and the impact, and that's it's easier to mitigate the risk then. But with risks that are externally driven, you can't control when that's going to happen. If a guy, you can put up all the firewalls and all the IT protections that you want. You can build a moat and put up a high wall and a portcullis. You can wear armor. You can do whatever you like. You can have arches at all the windows and everything. But if that guy wants to launch a cyber attack, he will, regardless of how good your defense are. You can't stop him, partly because you don't even know who he is or where he is or what form the attack's going to come in. The best you can do is get ready for it. So that's the E. And finally, the C in the IPEC risk is that potentially, thinking worst case scenarios, which is always a good starting point, and then you work your way back. Potentially, they're all catastrophic. And catastrophic, to my mind, is that they could potentially threaten the whole viability of the business. These catastrophic things are you suffer huge loss of life, huge financial loss, huge reputational damage, and from which you may or may not be able to recover, depending on how well, this comes on to the next thing, how well you actually prepared for the occurrence of these events in the first place. So I'm sorry to ramble on, Alex, but just to summarize the last interview we had, that was when I was introducing the concept of IPEC risks and why they should be dealt differently. And of course, we got so excited and so into our conversation last time, and quite rightly so, I say. But we never got round to the bit about, all right, what are you going to do about it? So it was sort of left hanging. So I think we're just picking that up now and taking it to the next stage. So I hope your listeners are clear now, so that IPEC risks are identified or characterized by the fact that you can't influence them. They're perpetual, they're external, and they're potentially catastrophic. And it sounds nice alongside OPEC.
Yeah. Well, it's also easy to remember IPEC. A lot of people remember acronyms more than they remember, a whole list of different characteristics, right? So,
that's right.
Acronyms actually help people, even though there's a lot of them. They actually do help.
Yeah,
well, I'm going to jump. Jump on something you already said. How do we prepare for IPEC risks then? My first question to you.
And it's a pertinent question because it means people have to change the way that they think. I think one of the biggest problems you've got in risk management, enterprise risk management in big organizations, especially international big organizations, one of the biggest hurdles is to create a risk culture in that organization where people can understand that risk deals with uncertainty. And when you're dealing with uncertainty, there is no right answer. All you can do is, based on the information you've got, provide the best analysis you can, given what resources you've got in the circumstances you find yourself at the time. There's so much uncertainty, particularly around risks that you can't influence the likelihood over. And I think the challenge of getting people to understand, in the context of uncertainty, that you can, one way, the traditional way and a very common way of assessing risk is to use the two parameters of how likely a thing is to occur, and if it does occur, then what would be the impact on the organization. So you've got your likelihood and your impact. And we'll come on to that, I think, later when we talk about how we are going to report IPEC risks. But if you can get that culture, the difficulty with IPEC risks is that you now have to change the culture back again. You have to change the culture back again, because the first thing you have to do is to stop people thinking about what's the likelihood or what's the probability of a certain event happening. You've got to get them to be able to accept the difference between an operational or an internally influenced risk and an externally a risk that has an external origin over which you have no influence. So what you've got to do is accept. You've just got to accept that these things can happen. Is it possible, if you've got your business in a place that is near to a fault line or on a fault line, or has been influenced by an earthquake in the past, is it possible an earthquake could occur in the future? Yeah, it's possible. Well, how likely? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's possible. How many people predicted the Icelandic volcano going up and affecting the whole of the Northern Hemisphere trade? That was completely out of the blue. The swarm of locusts in Malaysia a few years ago, right on top of the wildfires, which occurred in California and in Western Australia at the same time, all at the time where COVID was breaking out all over the world. And all those major events all occurred. They've all got their own probabilities. And I'm sure people have done their own modeling and their own studies about what they like, the mathematics around these things are. But then you take that further and you say, well, what about all of them occurring at the same time? Well, it's probably minimalist, but it happened. And it has a challenge for everybody listening, and you, Alex, actually. And that is, when you woke up this morning, could you have predicted right now, just pretend time stops right now, time finish, and freeze that frame? Could you have predicted you'd be sitting in exactly, to the millimeter, exactly that spot, looking exactly at me, wearing exactly what I am and behaving exactly as I am at exactly this time? You couldn't have done. And this is what life is. Life is about a sequence of characteristics, if you will, a sequence of circumstances that all make up the current moment. And as time goes on, that moment changes and it changes and it changes. And this is what time is. But actually, every single moment is all you've got. And there is no predicting exactly what the characteristics of that moment are, because there are so many things that are unpredictable in it. The best you can do is accept the fact that, Alex, you would have been sitting there at around this time, talking to me at around this time about this particular thing that we're talking, or something related. You could never have predicted it 100%, ever. And nothing actually is 100% predictable at all if you go into the detail. I mean, when if I can predict I'm going to work to walk. I'm going to predict I can walk to work. I certainly can't predict I can walk to work. But I can predict I can walk to work. I can do that thing, even if I can't say it. But I guarantee you, I won't be taking exactly the same footsteps, and that my feet won't land in exactly the same places. So yes, I can predict I can walk to work, but I won't be in the same place. I'm too excited about risk, Alex. So you'll have to shut me up when I go off. So the first thing you've got to train the mind is to just accept they happen. And what I think I would like to do at this point, if I may, is to take a lesson from nature. Nature, a wonderful thing. And in particular, certain mammals, badgers, squirrels, and others, during hedgehogs, during a particular time of year, they actually spend their time making the effort just to get ready for the bad times ahead. They've accepted the fact that winter is coming. And so they spend the autumn and the spring and the summer getting ready for that bad time ahead. And they either store up their fat in their bodies, so they've got something to survive the bad time, or they hoard underground and make little larders and things like that underground, so that when the bad time comes, when the difficult time comes, they can scramble underground or go into their nests or their burrows or whatever it may be, and they've prepared to survive that bad time. The groundhog goes one further, actually, because the groundhog changes its brain chemistry. So when the time of year comes to get ready for the difficult times ahead, its brain its chemistry in the brain changes, so that all they're interested on, their sole objective, is to get ready for those bad times. It's all they think of. So all they do is they wake up in the morning and they go out and they sniff around for food and they get food, and then they run away and they put it somewhere, and then they come back out, and this is all they do until, and it's a miracle, but until the day that bad weather happens, those bad times come, then they're ready miraculously, and they go into their thing and they survive the bad times and they come out, and for a few weeks, they have a great old time and all the rest of it. But then brain chemistry changes and they eat and they get ready. And what I'm saying is, not that we should all have operations and change our brain chemistry, but we should learn as human beings and organizations, we should learn from nature that you just accept that winter that rough time, that tough time, that cold time where your resources aren't available and it just isn't so easy to operate, and your supply chains are all suffering the same thing, you just accept that that's going to happen, and so you start getting ready for it now. And so that's how I would say we start, and that's letter A, to accept that these external events could happen. They may not, but you'll look a fool if they do, and you've just gambled everything away on it not happening. It's an investment to get ready for these events, and it'll stand you in very good stead with your board, your partners, and the industry in general. You'll be a model, actually, of an organization that cares not only about its bottom line, but it cares about its people and its brand, so much so that they are investing in things that may never happen. And people will call you, you're a fool for doing that, but actually you're the fool when it does happen. So that's the A, we should accept. Secondly, once we've accepted that, we need to brainstorm. So if we take, I don't know, well, why don't we take pandemics? It's current. And thank God we are now hopefully getting through at least this particular bit of it.
Yeah.
So then we brainstorm. We get our own management team together, and we say, okay, let's just say, sake of argument, now that we're all coming out of this pandemic and we're all literally beginning to breathe better with our masks off and so on and so forth. Let's just say, though, that somewhere in the world, a new aggressive mutant, a new aggressive variant of this virus has now found its way into the human body and is now spreading, and now we have a new, more aggressive than ever variant. What are we going to do about that? So from the lessons learned, let's sit down and brainstorm. Let's sit down and brainstorm how we can best prepare for that. Where did we go wrong? What took us so long to swallow our pride and accept the fact that we'd made mistakes? Where could we far better improve? What big decisions didn't we make quick enough? And all this sort of stuff. Go around the table, brainstorm that thing. Where could it affect worse? Where's the supply chain? Is it going to affect that supply chain? If it affects that supply chain, what have we got in place that we didn't have in place last time to mitigate that breakdown in operations? And then once you've done that brainstorming, you take into consideration that you're not the only organization in the industry, and you're not the only organization in the region that you're operating. And everybody, hopefully, if they adopt the approach to IPEC Risks, will be doing this acceptance followed by brainstorming. So once you've got your brainstorming outcomes all documented, and everybody else has, then you start communicating and collaborating. You all get together as an industry group or as a regional group, and you all say, here's the outcomes of my brainstorming. Where's the outcomes of your brainstorming? Oh, look, we thought of the same things here, but I didn't think of that one. Did you think of this one? Oh, no. And I tell you what, there's an opportunity together that we could work together here. You could use our place if that happens, and could we use your place if that happens? And so you do this collaboration within your industry, within your region, and that now is your C. See where I'm going, Alex? I've got an A, I've got a B, I've got a C. Guess what's coming? So the next thing is your D. Your D. And with your D, what you do is you take the outcomes of the brainstorming, and what you've got after that is a very rich data set of all possible scenarios and how it could affect. So what you've got to do is document that, and you document it in part of you document it in a risk register, but not a risk register that people are familiar with, which is your, well, more advanced organizations will be using software, risk database, integrated ERP systems and so on. That's fantastic. More smaller organizations and less mature ones will still be using spreadsheets in Excel. Again, that's fine, whatever works. But the key characteristics of those risk registers are, obviously you've got your risk ID and so on, but you've got your risk title, you've got your risk description, you've got your risk owner. How are you going to give it value? What impact value you're going to give it? Therefore, what's the risk rating? And based on all those risk ratings, let's rank those risks now from top to bottom. So we start looking at our category 1, our top risk or high risk, and we work our way down there, and so on. That doesn't work for IPEC risks, because there's no point in carrying out a risk assessment risk assessment needs a risk matrix, it needs likelihood, it needs impact, and it needs you to prioritize risk. There is no likelihood assessment. It's going to happen. Done. Finish. Throw the matrix out the window. All you're interested in is your impact assessment. And there's a big overlap here. And if we have time, we may talk about the overlaps of business continuity and enterprise risk management, because the two of them, the relations, very close relations. I think there's a fundamental difference, but we'll get to that if we have time. So your IPEC risk register, all it is down the left-hand side column. You've listed all your scenarios, your scenarios that you think that you've identified, and all your industry group or your regional group have identified. So you stick them down the left-hand side, and then across the top, you would have some form of categorizing, sorting out what the various impacts of these risks are in various under various headings. So I mean, a classic one for crisis management, for example, crisis management tends to use pairs. So people, environment, assets, reputation, stakeholders. When you look at external risk, there tends to be PESTEL, which is political, economic, social, technical, environmental, legal, and PESTEL-O. Some people stick an O on the end and call it organizational, but the point, and it doesn't matter what, you don't have to take something out of a textbook. And actually, I'm not very often moving away from the textbooks when you're talking about IPEC risks, when you're talking about crisis management, emergency response. The textbooks are all very well, but all they actually do is to give you confidence that you've got a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, but they'd never give you the answer. It's up to you. If PERS doesn't work for you, if PESTEL doesn't, if PESTEL-O doesn't work for you, think of one that does. Make one up with your own management team. So get your scenarios down the left-hand side, get whatever categories you want that affects your business, most appropriate to your business, across the top. And now you have a new matrix. It's no longer a risk matrix. It's now, let's call it an impact. It's now an impact matrix where you can quickly go down vertically against any one of the categories you've chosen, let's say environmental, and you can say, right, the main sort of IPEC risks, the main events that are going to hit us, that are going to affect the environment are A, B, and you read them off. Similarly, horizontally, if you look at certain scenarios, you can see which part of the organization they're going to hit most. So you can filter out either by event or by impact category. And then, so that's your D. Now you've documented your IPEC type risks. And finally, E. E is one that's very dear to my heart, because I believe in the whole IPEC risks, of course, and I wouldn't have gone into risk management, business continuity management for all these years had I not been interested in it. But what stands out for me is the E. E is exercising, and the reason that it stands out for me is because in all my time in ERM or BCM, the one thing that has consistently been a huge disappointment, often causing me huge frustration, is people's attitudes towards exercising. One organization I worked with, and I won't tell you who it was, actually did it very, very well. And I'll tell you what they did. It was an offshore incident. And what they did, this organization, they said to all the staff, don't book any leave or do anything between this week and the end of that week. And they gave a 2-week period, and the whole organization was told to block it out. They had to come to work unless there was a family emergency. You're coming to work. There's no leave going on in that period, so everybody's there. That was all they told them. So 3 days in, 4 days in, people are thinking what? And then somebody, who obviously the CEO or somebody, one of the planners, in the early hours of the morning, started the emergency response phone tree, the call out tree. And so everybody then went in to the office, and the thing was done absolutely perfectly. The organizers the organisers had a load of actors, journalists, which nobody knew about. They just turned up. We had hysterical families at the back gate. There was videos of the thing going on, and none of the management team had been pre-prepared anything. All they were told to do was take those 2 weeks off. They knew there was going to be an exercise, but there was no insight into what it would be or when it would be. And it was perfect, absolutely perfect. Perfect in the sense there was a lot of mistakes, perfect in the sense that people were rattled and tired and stressed, right through to the press conference at the end, where we had huge TV crews with cameras right in their faces, challenging them on why didn't you do this? Do you not respect your employees and all this sort of stuff? Excellent. But that is very, very much, in all the years I've been doing it, the exception to the rule. More typically, is people are told when the exercise will take place. They go into a crisis management room, and there's a very sort of complacent, almost social atmosphere in the room, and people chatting away. It's not taken at all seriously. Awful lot of laughing and guffawing going on. And then it ends and they all pat each other on the back and say, what a job well done that was. I mean, I just to redress the balance against the other organization, the worst I ever came across was another organization, and they went to an extreme. They handed out scripts to all the members of the crisis management team. So-and-so's going to say this. When they say that, you say that. This is now going to happen. And they just played a role, you know, reading from a play. It's like reading your part from a play. Absolutely ludicrous. There's no value in that at all. So when you're going to exercise your response to an IPEC type event, you've got to take it seriously. People's lives are at stake here. The business reputation is at stake. The brand is at stake. You may not be in work anymore. Your families are all going to be affected. How dare you be complacent over this and treat it with a social, almost humorous approach? You have to take this as real. And that is my E. So to answer your, sorry, I've gone on a bit too long with this one, but to answer your question, Alex, how do you prepare for IPEC risks? The answer is ABCDE. You accept they're going to happen. You brainstorm those events. You communicate and collaborate those events. You document those events in the risk register, and then you exercise. How is your organization going to respond to those events? And you exercise properly.
So my next question, because you already mentioned this, how do we report that? And I'm assuming we're reporting IPEC risks to the C-suite or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we report that then? Because you said there it's a separate. You don't report them the same way. Correct.
And again, Alex, it's with these IPEC risks, because if people are going to adopt it, it's going to involve that change in assessment of IPEC risks, because you're not doing away with likelihood, but the reporting of IPEC risks has by definition to be something different, because what we report to the C-suite, what we report to the executive leadership teams, what we report ultimately to the board are those things which threaten their organization. Now, the question that board chairmen of the board or directors that sit on the board, or even the CEOs and the executive leadership teams and so on, they are interested in the risks, of course they are, but they're far more interested in the answer to the question, so what are we doing about it? That's what they're interested in. Yes, we see these risks, but what are we doing about it? Now, the way I'm sure organizations have their own format and their own protocols of reporting this. I can only talk to you about what I've experienced generally. And generally what I've experienced is that when people do report to the C-suite, that there's a format which very commonly is a top 10 approach. We call it a top 10 approach, where they have simply listed the risk title, they've listed the risk the risk, not the risk grade, the risk, nor the risk rank. the risk value, the risk assessment value. So if you're going to use your matrix, your likelihood impact matrix, you know, your 4F, your 6C, whatever it's going to be on that matrix, they list that. I forget the word, it's a simple word, it's not even a risk language word, it's an English word. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. Rating, risk rating. There you go. Risk rating. So how do you rate your risk? You rate your risks on your matrix, you know, ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or ABCDE 1, 2, whatever it is you use. So you've got your risk title, you've got your risk rating. Occasionally you have, you know, your movement of your risk, whether it's gone up or down. Then you'll have your colorful matrix, and you put blobs on the matrix to show graphically what the overall profile is. And then you'll have your arrows going down, which say, if we implement these controls in this time period, this risk profile, these risk ratings, they'll reduce to this new lower risk profile. So we've gone from high, medium profile down to medium, low profile. Ideally, that's what you want. You can't do that. You can't do that with IPEC risk, as I say, because there's no matrix, there's no likelihood. So all you can do is get the impact matrix, which we referred to earlier, where you've got your IPEC scenarios and you've got your impact metrics across the top, and you report that separately but in parallel to your operational risk register result, which is all the other risks. So you've got to you've got to segregate IPEC risks from the rest of the bunch. And the problem is at the moment, the IPEC risks are integrated in the risk register. They're in amongst everything else. So you've got, you know, your risks of a loss of containment from a particular pipeline. You've got the risk of a guy falling on this loose ladder, or whatever your risks are. The risk of this supplier company becoming insolvent. All these things are all mixed up with cyber attack, geopolitical instability, a pandemic, and everything, and it gets so confusing. So by taking these IPEC risks out of the typical risk register, what you are doing is you're making space. You're allowing for more risks, more operational risks to go in, which will give the C-suite, will give the audience a far broader spectrum, a far more realistic view of actually what the risks are. And it gets around this problem, which I've always said is nonsense, and I will continue to say it's nonsense until somebody convinces me otherwise. Report your top 10 risks. I'm not interested in top 10 risks. I just want to know what the top risks are. If there are 3 or 4, I just want to know what the 3 or 4 are. If there are 30 or 40, I want to see those 30 or 40 risks. Don't give me just 10 and hide all the other stuff that I should be worried about because you think you'll get shouted at. I can't be doing with all that sort of approach. So what that does, actually, it takes the IPEC risks out and it frees up a bit of room, so that you've got more of a focus now on what is controllable, what is internally driven, what you can influence, and also on the on the same note, because you've taken out those IPEC risks and put them into a separate impact matrix, it focuses once more on those, and because they're reporting separately but in parallel, you as the C-suite or the chairman of the board or whoever you are, now the curtain has lifted and suddenly there's a lot more clarity. So that guy I told you about before that says, oh, I'm always hearing these risks, they crop up time after time after time. Yes, you do. But look, they are the IPEC risk, and that's what you would expect. It would be irresponsible of me not to report these. So you, Mr. Chairman, you also have to appreciate, you have to accept your A again. You have to accept that these things could happen. And that's our impact assessment of them. Now, here's the operational risk. This is slightly different because we can actually quantify these a bit better because we can influence the likelihood and the thing. So it's a very good question, Alex. I don't think the process or the format of reporting risks will change in the short term, but I'm not saying it should. I'm saying we should keep it. What I'm saying is, in parallel to it, we should have a impact matrix, which is the IPEC risks. So two levels of reporting, operational and IPEC.
Now, you kind of already answered this next question in a way, but just wondering if you have anything else to add to it. How does that differ for preparing from other risks? Because you did touch on it a little bit, but do you have anything more to add with that? Yes,
actually, I do. And I'm glad of the opportunity, because it lets me answer what I mentioned earlier about business continuity and ERM, and the relationship between them, which I think it's important that we get clear. So with traditional risks, we identify the risks through whatever risk identification process you want to use, but you identify, that's a separate, you identify your risk. Once you've identified your risk, you then about the business of assessing that risk in order to prioritize it. So you can prioritize your resources and how to mitigate that risk. And you prioritize it by using those metrics which I mentioned of likelihood and impact. So you've got your risk identification, then you've got your impact, your likelihood assessment, then you've got your impact assessment, then you've got your risk rating. And once you've got your risk rating, you could then get a prioritized list of risks. Once you have a prioritized list of risks, then you start looking at your budget, and you go to your management team and you work out what is commonly called RAPs, RAPs, or risk action plans. So you may have controls in place already. So we're looking at the risk rating as it is today. Some people call that residual risk. Other people call it current risk, but whatever works for you, as long as you're consistent, you do a risk rating on your current risk, and then you say to yourself, all right, which ones of these are outside of my risk appetite, which ones am I not comfortable with, and you allocate resources to those and you put it into a risk action plan, and then you monitor the actions that are taken. And once those action plans are complete, you then reassess, and hopefully it will have gone down either in terms of likelihood or impact or both, and you carry on that process until it gets to a level that you are comfortable with. So there's a process with not traditional risk. There's a process of identification through to assessment, through to prioritization, through to treatment, through to reassessment. IPEC risk is very different because there's no likelihood. I keep going back to that. So IPEC risk, you assess that they are going to happen, and all you've got to do now is ask yourself the question, so what if it does happen? What is the impact? And then once you've completed that impact matrix, all you do, you jump, and you don't start worrying about risk action plans. All you're worried about is continuing the business. You're all about mitigating the impact so that the business can continue. So you're going from scenario analysis straight through to business continuity planning. That's where you're going, as opposed to risk identification, risk assessment, risk prioritization, blah, blah, blah. No, you go scenario analysis, business continuity planning. Now, people say, well, what's the difference between, surely ERM, managing your risks is all about making sure the business can continue, isn't it? And the answer is yes, but here's the thing. Risks is objective based. Your risks are only risks if, first of all, they're in the future. Secondly, there's some uncertainty around it. And thirdly, if they affect your objectives, and that very much depends on what your perspective is. But that we could be here all evening, Alex, if we're talking about perspectives on risk and things like that. I'm quite happy to, but maybe another time. So, so risks is objective based. Risks looks at objectives and says, right, what's going to stop me from achieving these objectives? And then and that's a good starting point for identifying your risk. Some people will twist that around, and there's a good argument, I think. It's maybe oversimplified, but there's a good argument that actually says you shouldn't say what are my objectives and then what are the risks to my objectives. What you should be saying actually is what risks am I facing, and base your objectives on that. So you're flipping it. But anyway, that's for thought. But business continuity doesn't do that. Business continuity is process driven. So business continuity says, what are the critical processes over time? Key over time. What are the critical processes of my business? What are the activities that I need to do to make sure that those processes can carry on running? And then in order to make sure that those activities are in place, what dependencies, what are those activities dependent upon? What, in order to carry over those activities, what do we need? And that goes right down to pens, papers, paper clips, or servers, business continuity planning, computers, anything you want to say. These are all your dependencies that keep your activities going, that maintain your processes. We don't want to get into the science of business continuity management then, but to a predefined level over time, right? But risks don't do that. Risks are looking at objectives. Risks are looking at objectives and saying, what is going to stop me from achieving what I want to achieve? And these are the risks. Business continuity planning are saying, what critical processes do I need to keep on running? And the subtle difference, of course, and again, this is for debate, but is a critical process necessary if it doesn't achieve an objective? You could have critical process which doesn't actually achieve one of your particular objectives, but that again goes back to perspectives, which is a different story. Did that answer the question?
Yep. Yes, it did. And now I know we've been talking for a while now, but just wondered, did you have any final thoughts before we end anything? Any final thoughts on IPEC risks?
I would just encourage people, you don't have to call them IPEC risks. You don't have to agree with everything I said. In fact, hopefully you'll disagree with some of it, but hopefully not all of it. And I do hope that people will start to take, particularly in the light of the world today and everything that's happening, all the unprecedented things from before the pandemic itself, and everything more currently that's happened. People should stop living in their comfort zones and be prepared to step outside their comfort zones and accept that the winter is ahead, and start foraging for food and preparing for that hibernation period. And we should take a lesson from the groundhog and adjust the way that our brains work so that we can take future events, no matter how unlikely, seriously, and make sure that we are well prepared for them. And I will finish, actually, Alex, by saying initially that's going to be an awful lot of work and it might put people off. But once you've done it and once it's in place, and if you do what I emphasized earlier and exercise properly and seriously, it's just a matter of maintaining it. And you know what? That becomes a team building tool as well. So there's so many advantages of addressing IPEC risks. But as I say, if you get absolutely lost, just go back to the groundhog and remember our guy.
And on that note, we've come to the end of the show. Tony, thanks very much for coming back and talking to us about risks overall, specifically IPEC risks. I think there was a lot of interesting information there. I do like the groundhog example, by the way. I'm probably going to remember that for a while.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it, sharing your expertise and time with us today.
Always a pleasure, Alex. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Great. And to everybody watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.